diminish, hey, you guys are killing us here. That was what I think we were trying to convey in that, or that group or movement was trying to convey in that. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it was just a reaction, like not really a movement, and you can see that all the time, because anytime, I mean, there was just recently a black cop got shot by another cop who mistook him for no reason, and you didn't hear anything about Blue Lives Matter, so it's not about Blue Lives Matter, like it's about pushing down Black Lives Matter.
Yes, I did see that story about that cop who was going out to help assist. He was off duty at his home, and he was in plain clothes, but he was going out to help assist, and he was shot immediately by his counterparts who happened to be white, and it wasn't until they had shot him that they bothered to credentialize him, even though he was offering those credentials previous to being shot, and they weren't hearing it. So it's interesting, and that, I think, speaks to a bigger thing going on with a natural fear of, is it a fear of black people? When I was watching the Philando Castile thing, which is really what got me started on the show this week, I was thinking about that, and I'm going to tie it in later as we wrap up the show to respectability politics and what happened in that situation. But I realized that he did everything he could have done appropriately, but there was a fear. The way that the cop was screaming after he shot him let me know that he was in true fear. When he said he feared for his life, even though it wasn't reasonable, and even though the guy had complied and done all the things, there was a fear that was palpable in that man's voice. You know what I mean? And I think that is what is helping fuel the rash of kind of violence that we're seeing from cops that goes unchecked. So that is that's something that, to me, I don't think is happening in the national conversation. I don't think people are really getting what happens, and unless you're living somebody else's experience, I don't know if you understand that. So, yeah. When we were talking, you had said something about people feeling like they were purposely maintaining their biases. What do you feel that the biases are?
Well, I think they're just ingrained biases that have gone back down. I mean, going back to the fear thing, that started a long time ago. I mean, when they first started doing black and white movies, and that character would always be somebody who was raping white women and doing terrible things. And so those ingrained fears were set up to make it so that even after, slavery was over and things like that, that people were still afraid of black people. And that was the idea of it, was to make them seem like the bad guy in everyday life. And that hasn't gone away, even though really with, the access to the internet and things, it really should go away. And, anything like the way people speak and the way you look, people hold on to those biases, even though at this point there's no reason to.
Right, and it is an ingrained thing. We always say that, racism and prejudices are taught. Now, here's the thing. I want to be clear here, too. We all, every single race, every single color has their prejudices and has their own versions of racism, okay? So if you grew up in a West Indian family, sometimes West Indian parents don't feel that black American parents are doing what they need to do. And that was my experience, knowing that. So my mother had her own prejudices, okay, and had her own beliefs about a certain group of people that happened to look like her, but were culturally different. And so I get that. I'm not excusing it. So I'm not saying everybody should sweep themselves of every prejudice or bias, but I think your point is so important. We should strive to educate ourselves and be better about understanding the plight of another or what somebody else is going through. And it's hard to do if it's just the place that you've been in your whole life and it's what your parents are and you don't evolve. I was watching a TED Talk about one of the women that was in the Westboro Baptist Church, and she talked about some of the bigoted views they had and how she left and escaped, and how the only way that she changed her mind about what she was taught as a child, from the time she was a child, was to immerse herself with other cultures that the Westboro Baptist people had said were evil or the devil or going to hell, whatever their views were on them. And she said it wasn't until she was friends and interacting and having conversations with people that not only didn't look like her but didn't hold her same beliefs that she actually shifted. So it was like an immersion therapy of sorts that helped her unlearn some of her bigoted ideology, okay? And I think that not everybody can just be like, hey, I'm going to go. I think when they were dealing with integrating schools and desegregating and all of that, that was the lofty idea, but the hate was so strong at the time, I think it just didn't change anything. And now that I see that we can make a choice, we're educated. There's a word that you and I had talked about called woke, W-O-K-E, for those of you listening and don't understand, meaning awake. And it is something that people say a lot now. It's kind of bantered about being woke, meaning you're aware to social injustices of all kinds. This isn't just a black thing. It means be aware to sexism, be aware to bigotry, be aware. And I think that your generation is very awake. And I'm always fascinated because they still come from parents that have their prejudices or situations that aren't necessarily the best, but for some reason they're seeking to learn and grow. And so that gives me hope that before I die, that we could be in a place where Martin Luther King's dream could really be realized, where we're actually just liking each other because we like each other, and we're seeing no colors. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. And that brings me to this BuzzFeed video that you actually showed me that talks about the spectrum of racism. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it was I really love the video. It was just him explaining, like, the different types of racism. Like, it's not... Racism isn't like you're either racist or you're not. It's more of a spectrum. So, like, you have people who are outright racist who are, like, calling people the N-word and just flat out, doing terrible things. Like the KKK would be just outright racist. But then you also have other types of racism that are more, what's the word? We just talked about it the other day, too, and I can't think of the word. They're more small things, like...
Microaggressions, yeah.
It left me. Yeah, they're more microaggressions, little things like maybe seeing somebody's name on a job application and then not reading it as well as you should, or, following somebody around a store, and it just kind of changes and then it goes down. So it's not like racist or not racist. It's a spectrum that we all have to continue to work on to get lower on that spectrum.
So do you think that people can change their ingrained mindset about race? Do you think that's even possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not, nobody's asking you to, like, wake up one morning and just change the way you've thought your whole life or the way you've been taught your whole life. But you have access to the internet. Every book you could ever want is on there. All sorts of articles by people smarter than you, by people who have degrees are on there. There's no reason that you can't start researching and start meeting other people that maybe you've had those biases towards, whether they be black or, gay or any of those things, and learn that maybe your biases are not correct. So I think that it takes a lot of work to not lose those biases at this point. So I really do feel like if people are still racist or anything is sexist, homophobic, that you really have to try to continue to be those things at this point.
That's a brilliant point to me as well, because you're right. We are in the age of information. We literally have anything we could want to know at our fingertips via Siri, via Alexas, via Google. There is nothing that you don't need, that you can't know by Googling or opening up an app or talking to somebody or watching a video, BuzzFeed, YouTube, or otherwise. Everybody has an opinion, and everybody's always seeking, I think, to shift the conversation and move towards enlightenment. Now, there are some people that are stuck and want to keep things in their way, and I think that a lot of that is still happening in our country, as we can see with all the stuff going on recently. And that's not so much even about racism. That's just about, or maybe it is, I don't know. But there's about a way of wanting to keep things as the status quo and what was comfortable. I heard a lot during the elections of people saying, like, we're angry or white people are angry. This is what, was being said as people were polling and not understanding what was going on. They said they felt like their country was leaving them. They wanted to go back to what it was. And I think about what it was, and I'm like, the time when no one had any rights but white people? That's fascinating. That's when you wanted it to go back to? Okay. That was a reality check for me, because I'm super patriotic, Dina. As you know, I love my country, and I was like, what's going on here? Well, I love this country, and I'm lucky because I grew up in the 80s, and so things were shifting. Things weren't perfect, but they were shifting. I experienced tons of racism where I grew up, but I always felt hopeful, and I always felt like if I could excel, and I did the respectability politics, which I'll talk about later, that my mom taught me, I thought, well, maybe I'll get ahead. I didn't realize that we still had a long way to go. And it's funny because you talked about the microaggressions, which is a great segue. The microaggressions, how do you think that we can deal with microaggressions from both sides? And before you answer, I want to explain to people, Dina touched on it a little bit, but microaggressions are the tiny things that happen. They're the tiny, tiny things that happen. It may not be someone outright calling you a expletive, racist word, but it is someone doing small, tiny things, like Dana explained about reading a job application. And she'd also talked to me, off the record here a little bit, just about the process of that. There was a study done about, what were you saying about the sending in the job applications was a black name or a perceived black name versus a white name and the higher rate?
Yeah, I think they did, it was like 50 or 100 applications, and they were the exact same applications, but they'd send one with a name that sounded, black and one with a white name, John Smith or something. And they'd send one of each applications to all sorts of different places that were hiring, and the one with, John Smith was more likely to get a call back, even though the resumes were identical other than the name. Okay.
Perfect. So there you guys go. This is a thing that happens, and it has happened all the time. And that ties into respectability politics, too, because what black people do is try to police themselves, and they'll say, if you don't act, talk, or sound like this, life will be better for you, but that is not always the truth, and again, we'll get into that. So in regards to the microaggressions, do you feel like it can be dealt with from both sides? Because as a black person, I'll say, it's hard sometimes to correct the microaggression as it's happening. You understand it's happening, and you know that your place is to just kind of sit back and be quiet about it. That's the perception, or that's the feeling. Now people are speaking out. Now people are correcting their friends of all colors and saying, hey, that's not cool to say. But from your perspective as a white person, how do you think that microaggressions should be handled?
That's a tough one. I think it really depends on the situation. Like, I handle things differently at work than I would at home if somebody says something like that.
Right.
But I think we should still be calling it out. But I guess I feel like black people shouldn't carry the burden of having to call that out because it's not their fault that it's happening. So and in general, like, it shouldn't be people of color in general. It shouldn't be their job to educate us. You should be doing that on your own. And so for me, I prefer if, like, I call it out to another white person than make, somebody who's the microaggression is happening towards feel uncomfortable and not know what to say because, they don't want to get in trouble for speaking up and,
Mm-hmm.
because it's already harder on them anyways.
Mm-hmm.
But they need to be called out.
This is why I call you a social justice warrior in my heart, because, guys, listeners, Dina, I've seen her call it out to people, black, white, whatever. If she feels like something is wrong, she speaks up, and that is what I think is really being an activist. That's what I think really being an activist is about. Because sometimes we notice things happening, all of us notice things happening on all levels of life, not just dealing with race. And because we don't want to rock the boat, we don't speak out. And that apathy allows the situation to continue. And Dina doesn't allow things to continue, and she talks about them, and she's not scared to speak her mind about it. And she could be quiet. She's in the majority. She won. She wins by default. She could not say a thing, but she does say a thing. And that is your responsibility. I have had all people of all colors come to me and say, Monette, how can I change this? And I've had white people come to me and say, Monette, I want to do something. I had a person tell me once, I was speeding, and I knew I was speeding, and I was going however many miles over the speed limit, and I saw a cop pull over a black person who wasn't going as fast as me. And I knew in that moment that that's what had happened. Now, that was that person's intuition and feeling on it. But he's like, I see racist things happen all the time, and it just is crazy to me. How do I fix it? And the way you fix it is being like Dina. Maybe not being Dina. She's already got that job taken, and she's doing great at it. But you speak up in the moment. Obviously, you don't go up to the cop at the time and say, hey, you've arrested the wrong person. No, I'm not advising that. But I do think that if you're dealing with social interactions and you're noticing microaggressions happen where people are doing things out of the way or saying things that are making someone else uncomfortable, speak up. Now, we have seen that. And that's what I love about millennials is that There are all kinds of viral videos of people interjecting and stepping in. It reminds me of that show with